Great. It's lovely to have everyone here. We're going to make a start. I'm sure a couple of more colleagues will be joining us. Do feel free to make use of the chat, say hello. We want this to be a really engaging, informal session. So you'll get a chance to meet everyone in slightly smaller groups later on as well. So yeah, a very warm welcome. For those of you who haven't come across Edge before, we're an independent education charity working across the UK, and our work focuses on trying to make education more relevant. One of the strands of work that we've been leading, and my colleague Andrea, who's here, kind of kicked this off for us, was all about trying to learn a bit more from the past, to think back about the interventions, the policies that have happened over the past, well, 30 years, I was going to say, but actually Lorna's presentation is going to go back much further than that, and start to think about how the strands kind of weave together, and also some of the lessons that we might not have picked up from the past. For those of you who don't know me, I was previously a policy advisor in DFE, and there definitely wasn't a huge amount of corporate memory when I worked there. When you kind of landed in a new area, it was kind of, exciting and you got to really go for it, but there weren't a lot of people saying, hang on, we tried this before, we tried this 10 years ago, let alone 20 years, 30 years ago. So certainly I would have loved to have been able to kind of have the benefit of some of those things. So I'll pop a link in the chat in just a moment to our broader Learning from the Past project. We've also got a Dropbox for this session, a series of sessions, which I'll pop in the chat as well. This is the second of the series. I know some people have been to the first as well, which is around the philosophy of vocational education, and huge thanks to several of the participants who supported us with that as well. We've also got a third session, which is about current policy. So do feel free to sign up for that one as well. We're out of places for the live event, but everyone who signs up will get a copy of the recording to watch back at your leisure, as is the way now. So without further ado, very warm welcome to Chris Winch, who has been helping to chair this set of debates. So Chris, I'm going to hand to you for the first panel session.
Yeah, welcome everyone. And as Ollie has said, this is a companion series to the Principles of Vocational Education, just as important for the reasons that Ollie mentioned about the need for historical perspective, historical memory, the need to avoid cycles of failure in policy, which I'm sure will be alluded to in the course of this afternoon. And last but not least, I think, the way in which ideas, some good, some bad, some indifferent, keep popping up throughout the history of VET in Britain. It's now my pleasure to introduce our four principal speakers. Hewitt Keep of the University of Oxford will take the first topic. Lorna Unwin of University College London will follow, and Prue Huddleston of University of Warwick will follow on then. And then we've got Tom Richmond of the EDSK think tank, which he heads up. And like Ollie, he was previously a policy advisor. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Hewitt.
Right, I've unmuted. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I'd like to offer my congratulations and thanks to the Edge Foundation for undertaking this seminar series, but also for sponsoring the Learning from the Past project, because I really do think it is important that we try and do that. And as has already been suggested, structurally, I don't think we're very good at that. So I guess my first sort of set of reflections, and they're going to be very brief, is about time. If you look at the time series in the what was originally the Fettle document, which Tom and I and various others worked on, the key thing about that was that it shows very clearly that one of the things that policymakers struggle with is time. First of all, they don't remember the past very well because institutionally they're not set up to do it very well. But also they live in a world of political pressure where time is a luxury that policymakers often don't have. First of all, in formulating the policy, but I think in many ways, more importantly, in letting it sort of bed in and evolve. Everything's tends to be done in a rush. And if things don't look like a magnificent success within the first 5 minutes, then they're likely to get overtaken by another policy. So I do think there is a real issue about the timescales that we allot to policy change within our system. And I think that's quite problematic because when you look at many other developed countries, they give their reforms much longer to evolve and to prove themselves than we tend to do. And I think that impatience tends to lead to the kind of policy churn that I'm going to talk about a little bit now. I mean, in a way, policy is a bit like waiting for a bus. If you miss this policy, then another one will be along in a minute. And there's quite a lot of evidence to show that is our model. And I think that because we don't have a lot of policy memory, one of the things that comes through very clearly from the history of endless change is that if you're a minister, if you're a civil servant, then the current policies you've got are the only policies. In the sense, the past is irrelevant, and quite often you don't know much about it. And so the current policy armory is the answer. Once you've chosen your policies, they tend to be what you've got, and you just have to pursue them until a new policy comes along, or someone tells you you're going to have a new policy. So at the moment, the current policy inventory on vocational is really pretty much apprenticeships, more of them if we can manage that, and new standards, T-levels, boot camps, learning and skills improvement plans, and the adult learning guarantee. And that's it. I mean, and those innovations, interesting though each of them are being freighted with a really remarkable level of expectation and ambition. And I think that's a real problem, that things that are currently just running as pilots or as experiments or as in their sort of proving stages, already they're being seen as the answer. And I think that if we were able to start out with more modest goals and slightly less ambitious initial expectations, life might be better, because this has happened with every previous set of initiatives and programs and reforms and new qualifications we've had. So I think that's something that really comes through. And then I think that there is a sort of issue about, which comes through in the Fettle document, about change being an issue, in the sense that it's very hard for parents, for teachers, for colleges, for students, and for employers to try and catch up with the changing world of provision and to understand what they're meant to do within it, or what choices they've got within it. And I think explaining the system as it currently exists has been a problem for the last 30 years. And there's an awful lot of both research and anecdotal evidence that suggests that an awful lot of the people who we want to use the system or to benefit from it do not understand it at any given moment, because it's changing too fast for them to catch up with. And I think that is a huge, huge problem. How we communicate the policy change has been a problem over the last 30 years, and it's not one we've solved, at least as far as I can tell. But underneath all this policy churn of regulatory systems, funding systems, institutions, programs, qualifications, I think there are a few sort of immutable themes that come through, and I'll spend about the next 4 minutes talking about them, and then I'll shut up. The first, I think, is quite plainly a tension between the amount of power which over the last 30 years the centre in the shape of national government has acquired, and the power that is then left for all the other stakeholders and actors in the system. We do have a very centralised system. There's no escaping that fact. Compared to most other developed countries, national government controls an enormous amount of detail that in other countries would be devolved to other stakeholders or to other geographical and political levels. We don't have that. And I think that is an interesting sort of very distinctive part of our setup. And I think one of the sort of stories over the last 30 years has been about how power has migrated upwards. And in the last 10 years or so, as devolution has come back onto the agenda, it's also an issue about, well, what does the centre let go of and to whom? And I think that's a really major set of questions that suffused quite a lot of the change and quite a lot of the debates that's been going on about what is the respective role of different levels. Secondly, there's plainly a tension between markets and systems. We've oscillated through those over the last, say, 20 years. We've moved quite decisively towards these more contestability, quasi-market. I think that pendulum stopped swinging, is probably swinging back now towards more enthusiasm for cooperation and a systems-based approach, but it's not clear that the funding system actually really supports that. So I think there's a huge, both material challenge in terms of getting the funding system to encourage more cooperation, but also a cultural change exercise. There's funding challenges which have always been there. There are always tensions about who pays for what, the state, individuals, and employers. And we've not really resolved those. We've not come up with a steady state resolution in terms of who should be paying for what. And I think that's unfinished business, which again is going to keep cropping up. But obviously, the role of employers has been a major source of tension and disappointment. In 2010, the government said employers are willing to invest far more than they do at present in the skills of their workforce if they can be sure that the training they buy will be of high quality and geared to their needs. We need a new approach. Our aim is to shift profoundly the balance between the state, businesses and individuals. Well, that didn't really turn out as planned. Between 1997 and 2017, the volume in hours of employer-provided training in the UK probably dropped by about 60%. So employers have not been buying more. And I think that there's a whole series of questions about what employers are responsible for and what they could be expected to be responsible for and what their role in the system and in provision is. And again, it's one of those things we've not resolved. We've spent lots and lots of time arguing about it, haven't resolved it. And we're going to have to think much, much harder about that. There's a tension between adult and initial learning. Since 2010, plainly the loser has tended to be adult. But again, I think the long sort of Kondratiev wave has started to swing back. We have boot camps, we have a new adult literacy campaign, and the promise of the adult guarantee. And those may be the harbinger of things to come. But I'll leave you with a final thing, which in a sense is invisible in the Fettel document, is invisible in a lot of this debate, but it is one of the things that's changed profoundly in the last 30 years. And that is the relationship that FE and vocational education has with higher education. In 1992, HE was, incorporation, HE was a much smaller and less dominant part of the educational landscape than it is now. In 1992, I don't know how many FE colleges there were, I guess about 300 in England, far fewer universities. Now we have 140 full-line universities and about another 20 specialist institutions, and about 220 colleges. FE now exists to a large extent in the shadow of a mass higher education system, and that's a profound change that's crept up on us. And it has real long-term consequences about the space, the place, and the role of FE within an education system. So that's my little contribution to this, to get the ball rolling. And over to everyone else.
Thank you very much indeed, Hewitt. It's now my pleasure to turn to Lorna.
Okay, hello everybody. Greetings from Derbyshire. Where it's rather cloudy. Okay, although this event's titled A History of Vocational Education, I wanted to start with thinking about terminology, because actually much of the debate from the mid-19th century and really up to the 1960s was focused on technical education. So it's quite interesting thinking about calling the new qualifications T-levels. Have we gone back to the future? In the 1950s, the Board of Education at the time still had a technological branch, and people referred to their local FE college really well into the 1980s. Certainly when I know Prue were teaching in FE, people would refer to their college as the Tech. So technical is a term that's been around for a long time. And the 1956 white paper, Technical Education, which is quite a landmark document still in policy terms, defined technical education loosely as, and I quote, going beyond the study of materials and mechanics to accounting and commercial skills. So there's an attempt at a definition, and it would be interesting to see one now. because part of the problem here is we use terms very loosely and have done over the years. From the mid-1970s, we see a shift to the language of skills coming much more to the fore, starting really with James Callaghan's famous 1976 speech, where he talked about relevance and what employers wanted. And I think one of the other shifts over time, when you look at the history, is how there is much more talk today about employers as individuals. Whereas you look back, certainly to the 19th and early 20th centuries, there's talk about sectors and industries in terms of relevance and what training is needed, rather than employers as individuals. The Board of Education first used the term further education in 1906. In its regulations, and this is interesting, its regulations for technical schools, schools of art, and other schools and classes for further education. And a list of the classes that they were prepared to fund at that time looks remarkably like the mixed academic and vocational provision at a range of levels, including higher education. So the board funded colleges of further education and other types of institutions, for example, to deliver London University external degrees. So we had HE and FE very early on. So a mix of vocational and academic, and of course leisure courses were being funded right from the initial Board of Education definition of what it called FE. And that included day technical classes for 12 to 15-year-olds, full or part-time, and they were classed as preparation for employment to the local labour market. So it was doing both what we came to call in the late 70s, early 80s, pre-VOC. It was doing that then. So the term vocational education actually waxes and wanes over time, becomes more common from the 1970s onwards, when we get the certificate of pre-vocational education, and more talk about vocational preparation programs in the light of youth unemployment and also adult unemployment. And we also then get more fuzzy terms like the world of work, preparation for the world of work. So technical, vocational, where do we want to fix terminology if we wanted to do at all? So the history is complicated because so much of what happens, interestingly, is actually down to individual initiatives. So initiatives by employers, by educational institutions, philanthropists, and primarily by demand from individual people who want to improve their life chances, as it is today. All of that stimulated by economic, technological, and scientific change and innovation. So as the economy shifts, certainly from the later stages of the Industrial Revolution onwards, people are very keen to learn what they need to know to improve their career chances, either in work or to get into work or to change career. And a current theme at this time is how technical and vocational education loses out in terms of government funding for other national priorities. Something is always more important to governments over the years, and technical and vocational gets bumped off, or it gets a smaller slice of the pie. It has its roots, of course, in this country in apprenticeship style training organised by the medieval and trade guilds, similar to some other European countries. And the state gets involved very early on with the Statute of Artificers in 1563, when it tries to control or tries to regulate what it sees as a highly variable landscape of apprenticeship provision. All sorts of stuff was going on, some good stuff, some bad stuff, and the state has a go at trying to regulate this. In terms of continuity with today, what you find is the state doesn't put enough resources into monitoring the statute. You get various extra statutes in the 16th and 17th century that come in to try and boost it. But monitoring is hard, and right from the start, employers don't like it. Employers don't want intervention by the state. Turn to another theme. In the mid-19th century, you get concerns being voiced in lots of different commissions, public speeches by the great and the good and other people about the progress being made in other countries. So we have exhibitions like the 1967 exhibition in Paris, when Britain is horrified to see about how well countries like France and Germany are doing in terms of their technological innovations and their skills. So there's calls for Britain to catch up, and two interesting acts are passed. In 1889, the Technical Instruction Act gave local authorities permission to set up technical instruction committees, so the pre-runners of LEPs, if you like. And in 1890, the Local Taxation Act, also known as the Whiskey Tax, because it was a tax on spirits, gave them, local authorities, the right to spend money to support technical education. But only the right, so they don't tell local authorities you have to set up technical education institutions. The state stands back, and so we're slow to establish a national pattern of provision. And so vocational and technical education takes place or continues to take place in all sorts of venues. Employer premises, workshops, training schools. And in 1918, the Association of Technical Institutions, interesting title, which had been founded in 1894, recorded 127 colleges receiving Board of Education funding in England and Wales. But also, technical education was also occurring in 24 junior technical and commercial schools, 113 art schools, 28 day continuation schools for 13 to 16-year-olds, and 154 evening institutions. And there were also several polytechnics in London, because at that time, anybody could use the term polytechnic. Anybody could use the term college. It was a free-for-all. So by the late 19th century, technical education at all levels, I want to keep stressing that, is being provided in a range of different venues, and of course, mainly in the evening. Most people were studying in the evening. A key struggle from the 1930s, and I think this is an important part of the story, was to try and establish a national system of teacher training for technical teachers. A system that would be separate from the training of school teachers, because the argument had long been made that technical teachers needed a different sort of training. It was different pedagogy, different students, different context. But a key obstacle in the 30s was the fact that the majority of tech teachers were still part-time. as were the majority of the students. And so retention rates were slow. And although we start to get the establishment of 4 key teacher training establishments in the 1940s, Huddersfield, one in London, Bolton, and eventually in 61, Wolverhampton, we don't really get to grips with this early call for specialist type of teacher training. Another key area of concern and continuity, I think, which also affects the way vocational and technical education evolves, is the concern about the continuing access to general education for young workers. Because remember, we have children basically working many hours in the day, and we are very, very slow to raise school leaving age or even to bring in compulsory schooling. So 2 key examples of attempts to allow young workers access to general education and vocational education and training are in 1909, the Board of Education approved plans for day continuation schools. And it's interesting, their remit was to prepare young people for citizenship and the skills they required for, and I quote, breadwinning occupations. There's another interesting terminology. And the 1918 Education Act gave local authorities power to impose compulsory release for people under the age of 17. But it only gave them the power. Again, it didn't say you have to do it. And so what we see is that employers are reluctant to release young workers, and the LEAs, local authorities, back off. The 1944 Act sets out plans for county colleges, which also were predicated on the need for young workers to get access to general education and vocational education. But again, they were bumped off the list because other funding priorities came along. Now, interestingly, after the end of World War II, day release expands dramatically, and the colleges fill up with day release students from the civil service, other public sector employers, nationalised industries, and some private employers. Because of, oh, sorry. Can you still hear me? I've got a horrible echo. Okay, I'll carry on.
Should have sorted it out, Lorna.
Right, okay. Yeah, so the colleges fill up with day release students because there is a big demand suddenly from particularly public sector employers to try and increase the skills and also the general education of both people who are returning from the forces, but also younger workers. And it's interesting, the 1956 white paper had said, prior, as this was happening, it's the attitude of individual firms to further education that will count most. So in other words, it's only till individual employers actually say, right, I do need some training, that you get this big push in day release. Obviously helped by public sector employers who are encouraged by government to do so. So a couple of final points. Despite the growth in day release after the war, the concerns about which employers will release employees and which won't are then, alongside those, we get concerns about the quality of provision. That there always have been, if you look back at the historical documents, there have always been criticisms of provision, partly because, as I've tried to say, it was always so random and variable and unregulated. But this starts to heat up after the war. And in 1964, you get the amazing Industrial Training Act, when the state suddenly decides to make a major intervention. Perhaps, and I'll go out on a limb, perhaps the most major since the Tudor Statute of Artificers. So it brings in the Industrial Training Act, puts a levy on employers to do training, establishes the industry training boards and a network of group training associations, 40 of which also still exist. But all of that, and this relates to Ewart's key point about time, all of that swept away 20 years later in the early 1980s, when economic recession again shifts funding priorities, shifts the state's attention, and we get a shift to the marketized system, expansion of private training providers, and assessment-led qualifications. So I just want to return to the fact that much of the demand has come from individuals rather than employers as such. Although I want to say there are lots and lots of employers who do very good training and do support good quality vocational and technical education. But it's individuals, and the state is interesting in its response to that. So in the 1850s, we had the government-funded Science and Art Department, which administered a postal system of national exams to part-time teachers of evening classes throughout the country. And the introduction of the postal service and the railways meant wherever you lived, you could take part in these national exams. State intervenes again in the 1920s when it set up the national certificates, ONCs, HNCs, and again in the 70s with the establishment of the Technician and Business Education Councils, which of course are the precursors to BTEC. Vocational awarding bodies such as RSA and City and Guilds, who've been around for a long, long time, also played a big role. But since the 1980s, the successive governments have sought to steer from the top through the introduction of new forms of qualification, MVQs, GMVQs, 14 to 19 diplomas, and now T-levels. And it's not clear where the demand is for those in the same way as previously. So I think what we're left with is a very diverse and messy landscape of vocational education that's always featured many islands of excellence. We're really good at doing it in pockets. Excellent vocational education and training and technical education at all levels in different pockets, highly dispersed. What we still haven't got is a robust or stable plan to replicate and sustain that. And the history shows that every time there was an attempt to do it, something got in the way. Either it was government policy, either it was a war or an economic recession and it gets bumped off the list, or it's a kind of inertia that kicks in and you get a very good white paper or even a good act, but it's very slow to actually deliver. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Lorna. And I think we should move straight on now to Prue Huddleston.
How am I doing for time? I'll try and stick to the 10 minutes.
That's absolutely fine, Prue. We can squeeze the timing after you. So go for your 10 minutes. That would be great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Well, hello everybody. I am sitting about 10 minutes walk from the first day continuation college, which was established by Cadbury's here in Bourneville, Birmingham. The building is still there. It's not a day continuation college. It belongs to Birmingham City University. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to Cadbury's World. What I'm going to try and do quickly is have a look at the role of employers within the system. Ewett's already alluded to this, and Lorna as well. And much of what I'm going to say, you will find in a publication, which I think Ollie's put in the Dropbox, which is called Once More Round the Buoy, or Set Fair for a Better Voyage. And it is a short history of employer engagement within further education, within VET in general. It draws on about 30 odd years of research in the area. And also I'd like to thank Andrea Lachik, who's here, for a couple of the pieces of work that we did together on employers' role in qualification development. So is this something new? Absolutely not. The historians here will remember that in 1884, in the Samuelson Committee, hands were raised about the poor match between our education and training system and our productivity and our competitiveness. Even in 1925, a further publication I have here in my office, which says that employers are wringing their hands because people can't translate what they learn in classrooms into the workplace. And so it goes on. And now, of course, if we look at policy documents over the past 10, 15 years, we've got some well-known phrases. Rhetoric much the same, phrases differ. We've got employers at the heart of the system. We've got employers in the driving seat in another policy document. I wonder if they're really reluctant passengers, as I think, as Andrea and I said in one of our articles. So we've got these exaltations. All will be well because the employers will be there at the heart of the system. Well, there are some issues around this, of course. It's not straightforward. If we move on to other pronouncements, when we come to the Wolf Report in 2011, employers are going to be there again. Surprise, surprise. We're going to have local employers involved on a regular basis in assessment and awarding. We're going to have employers directly involved in development and specification of qualifications. Very strange that that was new in 2011, when in 2010, the 14 to 19 diplomas had been abandoned, and central to the mission of those diplomas was allegedly the fact that these would be designed by employers, and employers would be very much in the driving seat there in the development. So in 2011, a further exhortation for employers to get involved, and specifically, as I say, in qualifications. And I think this is a note of warning here about whether they really can get involved in the development of qualifications. Nevertheless, we move on, and in 2021, skills for jobs, employers are now, and I quote, to be given a central role. So from heart of the system to central role, they're still in the driving seat, if they're still hanging on in there, and they're going to work with further education colleges, other providers, local stakeholders to develop local skills improvement plans. So a coalition of the willing, we hope, or perhaps not so willing. I think the only thing that I'm pleased here that at least there's a recognition that there are other stakeholders involved, and this isn't just something for employers, but it's something for everyone else that has an interest in developing good quality vocational education and training. Of course, it's not straightforward. As Ewett and I said in 1998, there are a number of issues involved here, and we can't assume that employers will automatically jump into that driving seat or take up the baton. I mean, why would they? But there are some fundamental problems. First of all, we've seen a conflation of policy goals in VET, goals which are economic, social, educational, technological. And if we look at these policy documents, we'll see that the emphasis changes over time, but usually they all get in there somehow. And it's really trying to tackle this, the policy trying to tackle so many disparate things, with colleges caught in the middle, trying to balance these competing interests of all the stakeholders. This time, of course, it's all about the skills. Interestingly, we don't see too much discussion of curriculum or wider issues, but if we can fix these qualifications, all will flow. As you and I said, and everybody knows, of course, that employers is a very catch-all term. They're not a homogeneous group of people. For example, there are 5 million self-employed people at the end of 2019, according to ONS. And those are only the ones that are caught on the radar, as it were. Some sectors have predominantly very large numbers of freelance workers, small businesses, and self-employed people. So to talk about employers as if they were just a homogeneous group is just not helpful. Also, they will differ very much by the sector, even within the same sector, by the region, by their product market, their age profile. So it's not useful just to talk about employers as if they were a homogeneous group. And of course, this all depends, as I've said, on the coalition of the willing. It's a voluntary activity. And when we have new policy documents, we're told that employers are going to be at the center, but they can only really join if they feel it's worthwhile, something in it for them, and they can see the purpose. And also if their joining is rewarded in some way by recognizing, well, what happens at the end of all this? One of the failings of the diploma was, of course, that employers were asked to sign up, guidance kept changing, rules kept changing. They didn't really know what they were signing up to, and by the end of it, many were disappointed. So I think we need to consider perhaps why so much emphasis on employers, when employers, as I would say, are not the only fruit. If we want a decent system that's going to serve our regions and local areas, then of course, as emphasised in Skills for Jobs, we require a partnership approach. It's not just a matter of people shouting at each other over the barricades and employers throwing up their hands in horror about lack of skills. If you look at a partnership and you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, it says that it's a complex whole with a series of interconnected parts. So there are many partners, not just employers and education. And serving the needs of all those stakeholders, we've got young people, adults, people who are employed, those who are not employed. We have our colleges, local communities, and the wider society. So those stakeholders are not just employers. And as Lord had pointed out, that further education through its history has served multiple needs, different groups, different audiences, and tried to provide an incredible range of services. So it's all very well talking about employers and how there's a mismatch, but there are many other stakeholders in this. And a word of warning was issued by a publication from Pearson this year, in fact, saying that limiting the development of all qualifications to employer-led standards will not allow for the flexibility and agility needed to meet newly emerging demand and jobs of the future. And the more we look into this and the more we talk with employers, as I have done many times over the years, what they're very often looking for is something much broader than simply a certificate that says I can do X, Y, or Z. They are asking for those sorts of programs where young people will be enabled to change jobs, to move around flexibly, and to manage their own lives, actually, because for most people now, it's very much a portfolio sort of existence and uncertainty, fragility. So there's a danger in suggesting, get these employers in, sort out the qualifications, and all will be well, because it's absolutely not as simple as that. I don't wish to dwell too much on the negative, because we're here to probably learn some lessons. So I would like to offer some thoughts around positive engagement. From where I sit, both as researching in this field, teaching in the sector, and now as a governor of a big college here in Birmingham, I see the college very much as a bridge builder and a translator, or really more of an interpreter amongst all these different interests. They are central to holding the ring between competing interests, to understanding what the needs of their local communities are, which may indeed be quite different from the needs of a high-tech employer down the road. But of course, that's not to say we have to serve the needs of the high-tech employers as well. So it is not simple, but I think colleges are very well placed to act as a bridge in those communities. Some good examples, I think, at local and regional level are where there are sector boards, which are constituted within the colleges. The colleges bring these boards together with representatives of employers who are desperate to recruit able young people. They have vacancies. So what's the issue? The issue is clearly a mismatch of understanding about what's available, what's required, and trying to make those connections and act as a bridge between those two parties. Live projects, I would quote as another example, which have been particularly effective during the pandemic. At our college, in the academic year 1920, we were looking for 5,103 work experience places. Right. And you can just simply multiply that up by the number of colleges. So to write into a qualification that compulsory work experience, clearly it's just untenable. And that's what we're talking about, the mismatch between the top level policy, which Lorna's talked about, and actually making it happen on the ground. What has been so impressive actually this year is that a lot of the colleges actually managed to carry on without work experience, but they've actually used very creative ways to use employers, to get employers to write project briefs, to send problems into college for the students to solve. And I don't mean let's pretend, actual real problems which the students have worked on and come up with a concrete solution. And several of which of course have been put into practice within the area. So that's the kind of grassroots employer engagement. And in fact, it's been of huge benefit to employers as well. So employers then can contribute authenticity, but they shouldn't be asked to do what is beyond their competence or their appetite. And I think too often policy has assumed that employers will do things which may not be within their competence, and quite frankly, they don't have that much interest in doing anyway. So when we try to engage with employers, we should be, or policy directors should be abundantly clear about what's being asked, not changing, and then setting out the expectations quite clearly in terms of the time and the scope of the tasks. And this was a big lesson coming out of the 14 to 19 diploma development, because employers were really not sure what they were signing up to. And then what they got was clearly not what they thought they'd signed up to, because it's a very different matter developing a qualification. And I'm fearful of the T level, but I won't dwell any further on that, because I think we're rerunning something that happened before in a very similar way. And I think a further point really here is amplifying student voice. Colleges are there to serve the communities in which they're based. They're not there only to serve employers. They're there to serve learners, whoever those learners are. And they can play a very significant role in amplifying the student voice to employers. After all, the employers are looking for recruits, they are future recruits, they are their current or future customers. And the importance of the student voice in terms of helping to design a curriculum that suits needs of stakeholders is absolutely crucial. And I think we've forgotten that in all the policy about the role that students may be able to play. So what I'm saying here is that it's really, we've been faced with a lot of very simplistic statements about getting employers in the driving seat, getting them at the heart of the system. It's far more complicated than that. And it needs to take account of all the stakeholders in the system. And it involves crossing some boundaries across those different constituencies so that actually the curriculum can face not just both ways, but actually it needs to face several ways in order to serve the community appropriately. And the local community is quite different from the national community. We have very specific needs here in Birmingham to address. They may not look like national priorities, but for us, they're absolutely crucial. And the college is there managing these expectations, as well as meeting funding targets and all of that. So what I would say is that we require a much broader constituency and consensus beyond simply putting employers at the heart of the system or in the driving seat. Employers are certainly one part of an interrelated and interdependent ecosystem in which colleges have a key part to play. So I would ask, and perhaps we can take it up in the group, whether in fact we've solved the issue of employer engagement beyond simply saying we need more employers to get engaged. And what can history tell us about the way in which we might engage with those employers? So I'll leave that up to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Drew. And now we'll turn to our final speaker, Tom Richmond. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation to come along and speak today. I'm going to spend my 10 minutes talking about a document that's already in the chat, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, called Honourable Histories. A big thank you to Hewitt and to Ruth Silver and Fettel and all the other people who helped pull this document together. What we tried to do in this document is look back over the past sort of 30 odd years and ask what has happened and when, and to an extent why as well, in terms of the reforms that the world of FE has been through. And it was a fascinating exercise. It's not actually a very long document. It's a very easy thing for you to canter through if you've got a bit of time. And I would strongly recommend that you do, because I think there are some very, very helpful lessons in there, genuinely. I should say that we were torn between calling it honourable histories and horrible histories, because in policy making terms, I have to say there are a few horror shows in there, but I'll quickly try and run through those today with you. So I think that my observation really from the whole idea of putting together this honourable histories document was, it just gave me a very strong sense of deja vu as I was writing it all the time. I was sort of writing one page of it and then going on to the next page and writing something else and thinking, you know, I'm sure I just wrote that just a couple of pages ago. And then I go back and I look, actually, no, I really did write something like that. It really did happen 5 years ago. It really did happen 10 years ago. And yet we're still having those conversations now. And I think there's a few things that I'd pick out, just as a few highlights of things that I think, looking at this this really wonderful exercise, things that we still just don't seem to have cracked after many, many governments worth and ministers worth and large funding pots worth of effort. Adult literacy and adult numeracy is, of course, an obvious example. I, like many other people, was delighted to see some more money from the Chancellor yesterday into adult learning. But there is still that question of how, after all these years and all these schemes that we've had, we still have millions, literally millions of people in this country who don't have basic literacy and numeracy skills. It was a very common theme throughout the document. It spans governments of various different parties. Something still has not worked in that space. Obviously, I'm sure we'd love to see it improve. Institutions as well. the government has this a bit of a penchant for designing brand new institutions and often sort of superimposing them on the sector, whether the sector likes it or not. Just some examples of some which have been created in inverted commas over the years. Institutes of technology are, of course, probably the most recent incarnation of this. We've had national colleges, national skills academies, centres of vocational excellence. All of them, of course, look slightly different from what came before it, but there is still this recurring pattern of, well, what colleges, are they colleges not able to deliver something? Is there something that colleges are not able to do that we need to sort of add this other layer on top, and it sort of just gets parachuted in sometimes, and then it might be gone a few years later? That is, again, one of the themes that I think comes up, lots to explore potentially in the Q&A on that. Employer voice, of course, as Prue and Hewitt have rightly mentioned, I won't go over it again, but it does come up a lot as a repeating theme. Do we need government-funded institutions to collect employer voice? Do we need individual employers, as Prue was saying? Is that a good way of doing it, or do we need employers to come together themselves? Or what if they don't come together themselves in some sectors? Who then speaks for the sector? Then we've had UK Commission for Employment and Skills. You've had the sector skills councils working with the SSDA at the time, and we're just still having these conversations. So we've actually gone from quite a top-down model to a very fractured model now. I don't think we necessarily got the answer right at all, but again, this is just a constant theme throughout 30 years of policy making. You rightly mentioned the question of who should pay. Who should pay for improvements in people's skills? Should the government be paying in a kind of train to gain style model? Should we be forcing employers to pay? Well, what if they don't pay? And what if they say that's not their problem and they're actually not interested in paying? What about the learners themselves? Of course, we have a loan system that has been tried. Is that the right answer? So this question of who should be paying to improve the level of skills that we have in our economy is still unanswered after all this time. Lots of things have been tried though. And finally, the FE workforce. This has been a theme of many documents, many white papers, many reports, and yet even now we're still having this conversation, and rightly so, about the quality and quantity of staff we have in FE. Have we got the right blend? Who else do we need to take part? How do we make sure we get the people? Do we need them from industry? If they're going to come from industry, who's going to pay for that, and what incentives are there? And if you're a classroom teacher, why don't you go and get paid more in a school than you do in a college? And it's just, we're still having these tensions in the system about how we improve that FE workforce. Many reports over many years on that. So I think honourable history shows very clearly that there are some things we just still have not cracked. That doesn't mean we can't crack them, but we still seem to be having the same conversations. I think that honourable history also shows that some things have diminished over time. You look at the way the careers education has been talked about a lot, but has been increasingly talked about a bit less and less, at least as government's problem to solve. But we haven't really had anybody else step in there to grab that agenda and run with it, because the funding hasn't been there. So that does come through quite a lot. The role of quangos and top-down agencies has clearly been cut back over the years. Some very, very large-scale efforts. Of course, the Learning and Skills Council being a good example. That agenda seems to have diminished now. I don't see us going back to that kind of model in future. Capital investment. Who's going to pay to keep the college estate in the kind of state that we need? In again, very pleased to see some money in the spending review coming through for this, but that does come off many years of that being a pretty sparse area for government investment. So it does feel like it's slipped away a little bit, but it could be coming back, fingers crossed. But at the same time, this honourable histories exercise did show us that there are some positive changes, and maybe we are learning some things from the past, which I think does give us some cause for encouragement. Prue's talked about employer ownership, and I certainly wouldn't say that we've cracked it. It's wonderful to see Sue Clark on the call today, because when I was thinking about employer ownership, the question of who designs and who approves qualifications is a really interesting one. Maybe employers shouldn't. Do we really want an employer trying to design a specification for a high-level technical qualification? I mean, have they got the time? Have they got the energy? Have they got the expertise? Do they know how to design an assessment? These are really good questions. Maybe they should be taking a role in approving qualifications as we used to do with something like tech levels rather than the T levels which employers are designing. I think there is a sweet spot in there somewhere. I'm not sure we've got it yet, but I do see some signs that the government recognises that getting employers to take a look at what's happening is definitely a good thing, even if they haven't quite got the model right yet. I do hope that employer input has been genuinely valuable across apprenticeships, T-levels, and indeed other spaces too. So I do think there is some room for encouragement there. Perhaps a more responsive system. Skills boot camps, of course, are a relatively new brand. They're not the first time something like this has been tried, of course, but the idea that actually maybe shorter courses are needed. Maybe we need to have something a bit more responsive, a bit more snappy for particular sectors and solving particular problems. You know, the fact that the government had to intervene very strongly when it came to HGV training, for example, showed that the system still wasn't quite responding to employee demand, I think it's fair to say. But at the same time, maybe this model of boot camps, which has got a lot of support in government and beyond, maybe there's something we can work with in that. I think that does learn a few of the lessons of the past in terms of responsiveness. Apprenticeship funding, we've got more money in the apprenticeship system. I don't think the system itself is necessarily working brilliantly with the levy, particularly for young people, but at the same time, the quantum of funding has dramatically increased over the past few years. Can we just try and change the system to get some better outcomes out of it? Possibly. I think that could be a good move. And one of the most interesting things that we've seen, and I think the Auger Review deserves a lot of credit for this, is we're talking about funding people rather than qualifications. This has not always been the case. In fact, quite the opposite in many cases in recent years, where the government's been very keen to get someone onto a qualification for a qualification's sake, that if we just count the number of qualifications, we've done our job. But actually, I think government realizes now that we need to look at things a bit differently, and we need to talk about, are we transforming someone's life chances rather than, are they just completing a qualification that we put them on? I think that's a very positive thing. And so just finally, I mean, what does this all mean for policymaking and policymakers? I mean, this honourable histories exercise was fascinating, and it was a bit concerning on some parts, don't get me wrong, but I think we are starting to see some green shoots in terms of really positive progress that can be made. And it just shows, I think, more than anything, that really good evidence-based policymaking is genuinely possible in this space. As an example, I would probably pick something like the fact that we're moving the conversation onto outcomes, things like employment returns, wage returns, rather than just giving someone a qualification. You look at the work the Centre for Vocational Education and Research has done, the work the Edge Foundation has done. People are pushing really hard on this agenda so that we start talking about outcomes just rather than just simple inputs. And I think that does go to show when a lot of really smart people come together and we start trying to build some really good bases on which to, sort of evidence bases on which to then base future conversations, that we can make a difference. You only have a look at the debate that the Auger Review has sparked on the returns to higher education versus further education to show that when you get these things right and you feed good information and good ideas and really positive reforms into a conversation, that you can quite dramatically change things in a relatively short space of time. The higher education sector might not thank the further education sector for doing that right now, because it's been a pretty tough time for them politically, but it's the right conversation to be having, which we simply weren't having 5 years ago. And so I do see, again, some green shoots in terms of if we can build the evidence and we can build those coalitions for change, you can get somewhere pretty good. Yes, positive change is slow and sporadic. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of people in this call who've worked in government and around government to know that, but I do see some causes for optimism, and I hope that we can pick those up in the panel discussions later on. And that's me done.
Many thanks, Tom. Ollie, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. That's great. And thank you so much for our speakers. Chris, do you want to kind of draw out any kind of themes just for a couple of minutes before we have a quick break? There was so much in that.
There is indeed an awful lot in there. And I've got a few points, by no means exhaustive and perhaps a bit idiosyncratic. I think the issue of the importance of all of this for policy learning is a theme that came through in everyone's talk. The whole question of engagement, employer, individual, other stakeholders. Again, this was an important theme. Something that was touched on, I think in the last talk by Tom, which seems to me of great importance and perhaps worth further attention, is the way in which careers information, advice and guidance has declined over the decades. And finally, I think there's a point here, a muted point perhaps, one that nevertheless, about ideological conflict. We've seen quite a bit here about changes in direction, quite drastic changes in orientation. The Industrial Training Act was mentioned by Lorna, and then 20 years later, another switch. And ideas were behind this as well. There was circumstance, definitely, but also quite powerful ideas were in play in both cases. So I think the history of ideas, if you like, and the way in which they manifest themselves in vocational education is also a theme worth considering. Those are my preliminary thoughts.
Really helpful as always, Chris. So we've digested a lot. I'm going to suggest we just have a quick break until 1:15. When we come back, we're going to go into breakout groups for about 20 minutes. So a chance to really digest and draw out some of those themes. I'll pop a quick note of some of Chris's points in the chat so that we have it, and then we'll come back for a final panel session. But go make yourself a cup of tea. We'll see you at 1:15. Wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. Just a reminder to pop yourselves back on mute now that you're out of the breakout rooms. If you've got a couple of questions or thoughts to add to the discussion, please feel free to pop them in the chat. And then I'm going to hand over to Kevin from the University of Huddersfield. Welcome, Kevin, to chair this final part of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ollie. I must say it is a particular pleasure to have the opportunity to consider these issues in a historical context. How rare that opportunity is and how valuable this is. I hope we can do similar things again, and thanks to Edge for bringing us all together. While I am waiting for other colleagues to put their questions and so on into the chat, and please do, and I will raise them. Allow me to pose some questions to the panel. I'm going to start with you, Chris, if I may, because at the very end, you said that our system doesn't just react to situations, it also reacts to differing ideas. And I wonder, would you expand on that? What ideas have shaped FE and technical education?
That's a very difficult question to answer briefly. Just now in the breakout room, we were talking about what Lorna mentioned, the Industrial Training Act, and looking at some of the ideas behind that, for example, about closer party political cooperation. Also, the idea of tripartitism, or what's now called social partnership. I think these were live ideas about the governance of VET at the time. Now, to some extent, perhaps through political fashion, discredited. But going even further back than that, going back to Adam Smith, for example, we can see ideas about the way in which the work process is organized, the kind of VET needed to handle situations where labor processes are disaggregated. Talk about skills, I think a lot of that comes from Adam Smith. A lot of suspicion about corporatism, again, comes from there. So I think that's a fascinating area for exploration.
I agree. Is there anybody else on the panel who would like to pick that up? If so, just please jump in or wave. Lorna, you look like you're, oh, sorry, Ewart, I've got Ewart.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick. I mean, well, obviously, Chris has done quite a lot of work on this in terms of the way in which, our conception of skill is different to that which is found in many other continental European countries who have a deeper and more sophisticated notion of what skill is and how it might be linked to things like theory and knowledge as well as practice. And that's plainly had a massive impact on our qualifications through the NVQ movement. And in a sense, you could say that T-levels is the pendulum swinging back again. But it's a very determined attempt to return to knowledge and theory, which is something that we took out of vocational qualifications because of a set of ideas around competence. So yes, ideas really, really matter, and they genuinely directly shape policy.
Yeah, and I interesting to think about our history in relation to the interpretation of the word skill. Lorna, did you want to come in?
Well, just briefly to say that, again, in the, was it linked to the breakout group, I was saying there that you could almost do with an annotated column down the side of this conversation, or indeed down the side of our inputs, where you say what was happening at the time in wider society, what was happening politically, what was happening culturally, how did the country look at that point, what did people care about, What did governments care about? And I think that helps then to start to say, because Chris posed the question to me, was the 64 Act a complete aberration? And I think, you know, if we try and put policies within a broader context, that I think that's important, because they don't just appear out of the air. And the other point is, I was very conscious for something else I was doing, looking back at the history of how MVQs were developed. And the more you look at that, there was a group of what were called at the time modernizing civil servants, who were just given their head, allowed to, you know, go and just design these things. You know, people like who are old enough in this room, you know, Gilbert Jessup and so on, who were allowed to just get on with it. And so there are things of the moment where at that moment there was some, you know, for good or ill, there was freedom within a certain part of the civil service, the employment department and so on, to just, interestingly, perhaps not the DFE, as was at the time, to get on and design something. Mm-hmm. But of course, what that then tells you, which is different to other countries, is how some of our policies is done under the radar. So what always fascinates me in comparison to other countries is how we get policies announced, and the sector, you know, the people who've got to deliver them, oh, right, we're doing that now. Whereas, you know, in countries with more of a social partnership, these things would have been developed in consultation, and you wouldn't get that sudden shock, right, let's change, we've got to change the name on the box and move on.
As somebody was saying in the chat, the idea that the bus, you got run over by the bus of policy. Yes. Prue, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just as an illustration of what Lorna was saying, you know, the whole obsession with getting YTS, for example, up and running, which was driven by the fear and horror of the mass youth unemployment. And it also relates to the point I made about we asked policy and vet to do so many different things. You know, at that time we were desperately concerned about youth unemployment and social, so it became a sort of social policy tool. At other times it becomes another type of policy tool. So I think, you know, you're absolutely right. They see this, oh, vet will solve this. So yeah. Knee-jerk reaction.
Yes, thank you. Allow me to move us on. One of the things that came up in the discussion that Ollie noted was stability and whether we should have it. Tom, can I start with you? That you've worked with policymakers, you wrote honourable histories. Is stability desirable, and is stability achievable within our further education skills system?
I mean, I would immediately point to what Hewitt said about centralisation. I think it's quite hard to get stability when the power rests at the top and the people at the top could change. You don't need me to tell you that, you know, realistically, to get to design, implement and embed reforms of any nature in the education system successfully, a 10-year time frame would probably be the minimum that you'd really want to look for. But ultimately, with the system that we have, with the power very much centralized in government, in the current government, any current government, I should say, that they won't generally look over more of the 5-year time frame, and will then perhaps, you know, as a result of that, might then, as you were saying, they might start rushing, they might start taking shortcuts because they need to get something needs to be in place. Something has to be there, or bad things will happen. I think it's only when you talked about, you know, we've heard very social partnership. We haven't talked about devolution very much. That might need another 2-hour session, Ollie. So I think we'll come back to you on that one. But actually, when you have the power more dispersed in the system, it gets harder for one actor to then change things around, to say, oh, I'm a new minister, I don't like the look of that. I've never seen an FE college. That doesn't look like a good qualification, pulls the lever, and all of a sudden, you know, bad things happen. So to me, the question of stability is much more usefully, I think, poses a question around power and just the dispersal of power. I think that's a good thing rather than aiming for stability itself. I think you get that from changing where the power lies. Not that politicians are known for giving up power on a regular basis, I have to admit, but that to me is where I think devolution has enormous potential. We'll see with the levelling up, plans from the government later on this year, whether they really do believe in devolution or not, because I'm a little bit sceptical, but we are where we are. But if you do disperse the power and you get those local conversations and local partnerships happening, irrespective of which minister or government's there, that's when I think you get some quite powerful change.
That's a really interesting distinction you make, and that's fascinating. Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel want to pick that up, especially perhaps in relation to devolution? Ewart.
I'll be very quick on this. Yeah, I mean, I think Tom's absolutely right. I mean, the thing that really stands out with our system is it changes a lot. Why does it change a lot? Because, yes, very few people are required to meet together, agree, and it happens without any consultation and without any right of veto. Yeah, I think devolution is going to be fascinating, but all I would do is draw your attention to, I think it was the Local Government Association who said that they believe that of all the central government departments, the one that was most opposed to devolution in any shape or form was DFE. I couldn't possibly comment on that remark, but it does seem to me that the grassroots see some potential difficulties. So it'll be really interesting to see what the Levelling Up white paper and the new devolution deals paper is going to say, because I think that's the acid test at which we see. But also, don't assume that DFE think devolution means devolution to local government. Devolution can mean devolution to other bodies. So the local skills improvement plans are seen as devolution. So devolution can take many forms. So yes, a workshop on that would be really fascinating, but preferably after we've had the Levelling Up white paper.
Yes, although of course there is history of this, and I see Paul has just noted the regional development agencies, for example. We have, we've been around this block, or close to it at least, before. Lorna, did you want to come in here?
Gosh. Well, I've been doing some work in Greater Manchester around education and training and what power should be devolved and what shouldn't, and so on. One of the arguments that comes up from colleges, schools, universities quite frequently are concerned, particularly from colleges, are concerns about equity. So, the national standard versus local interpretation. To what extent could that be a problem if you allow local areas to do their own thing? I think there might be some kind of protectionist element to that, in terms of being concerned to run programs that get maximum funding, etc., etc. But I think there are questions to again that go back to the individual, and linked to that is the idea that, does levelling up mean you want individuals to stay in Oldham, where I'm a FE college governor, because that's good to try and keep well-trained people in Oldham, or does the individual actually want to go and work in Sheffield or London or whatever? So I think there are tensions there. Yeah.
I think that's an important point to make, Lorna. I know you've made it in an article with Bill Bailey, that FE colleges have always responded to a market. That market is what individuals want to study. And working in an FE college for many, many years, you didn't know which course was going to be biggest until you saw the queue of people in September waiting to sign up. Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else want to come in on that before I move us on? Just looking at the panel. In which case, and I again, just something that came up a lot was and again, I'm interested in what history tells us about the primacy of the employer and what that has meant at different times. And in a way, how the employer has been conceptualized, the notion of whether it is individual employers or indeed the employer groups, for example. Does anybody want to pick that up, the primacy of the employer? Prue, I can see you're waving.
Okay, yes. We had a very good discussion in our group about that. And this whole question of, well, who are the employers? And the fact that there's a sort of national top-down prescription about you will engage with employers. And the situation is very different in different parts of the country. And also we feel that the SMEs, it's extremely difficult to engage, and with many self-employed people. So this prescription about employers just fails to take into account the heterogeneity of employers. And this, for all sorts of reasons, this just doesn't work. And I think it was a point that Martin in our group made very well, that there needs to be a different sectoral approach, because sectors are very different, and that would be more helpful. But the primacy of the employer has been really a sort of devilish thing to deal with, and it's not been resolved satisfactorily at all, in my view.
Yeah. Anybody else in the panel want to pick anything up there? Ewart.
Okay, I'll have a quick go. I think there are really two ways in which the employer has been seen. One has been seen as being customers. So employers are relatively passive but grumpy customers who basically set out a list of demands. We want X number of X, we want it now. And we're not paying for it either. And that's not a particularly fruitful way of doing things. And I think there's a real danger that the local skills improvement plans will follow that model, at least initially, of just basically providing a sort of a Christmas list to Santa of things that employers would like the local colleges to deliver. The other way of looking at employers is the way that, say, Germany would look at them. They are part of the education and training system. They're not detached customers, they're co-producing. And unless you have co-production in terms of apprenticeship, adult workplace training, then your skills system will never function properly. And we've never really been able, we quite like Model 1, government quite understands that model, but it really finds problems with Model 2, because that means conflict and it means confrontation and some difficult discussions. But until we move towards Model 2, we're really going to carry on having problems.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Ewart. Chris. You're muted, Chris.
Thanks. I just wanted to come in on that point again very, very briefly. Really, it's quite right. It's in countries like Germany, employer associations are the norm, and sectoral employer associations in regions cooperate with each other to provide VET, and that's partly a cultural matter. I think it's partly that there is a, if you like, a societal predisposition to work together, and that, I think, is also one of the preconditions for the social partnership. Now, I know, to go back to Adam Smith, he was very suspicious of employers clubbing together. Nevertheless, I don't think the fact that British employers don't club together is because they've read The Wealth of Nations. There's something else going on here, I think, which is worthy of further investigation.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. Now, I'm aware of time, so I want to go to each member of the panel, if that's all right, because one of the features of these discussions, the last one and this one, has been the need for partnership in order to develop curriculum, in order to develop new courses, and in order for the system to meet the needs of our society and our economy. So who should be, learning from history, who should be involved in that partnership? Tom, can I start with you, just because you're first up on my screen? Who should be in that partnership?
Who shouldn't be involved in that partnership? I mean, I think going back to some of the previous comments, it sort of all links together in my head, in the sense that we've never really had, I don't think, compared to other countries, my sense that we've never really had a very good concept of people transitioning into employment rather than just sort of being dumped in employment. We have our education system has got cliff edges, all sorts of age groups, adults, young people, 14, 16, 18. We sort of just spend a lot of time trying to push people up a hill, and then they sort of just fall off, and then we hope there's something waiting for them. And I think that really makes it quite hard for people to come together. It makes it quite hard for employers to know, well, am I supposed to just be waiting for someone to just appear at my front door, or should I be trying to speak to my local school and college when they're 13, 14 years old? And I think without that ability to have just a really clear understanding that we've all got a stake in this same conversation, I think it does encourage that. We've obviously haven't talked much about the fact that, about employer investment in skills, but it's obviously been historically a big problem in this country because we just haven't got those relationships right. So yes, employers need to be part of that, but notwithstanding Prue's very important comments about who are employers, but if you give people a reason to have these conversations and give people a stake in these conversations, I think that can change the conversation quite dramatically. I mean, obviously, without knowing what devolution is going to quite look like and what role local authorities are going to play and whether LEPs are going to continue to exist, it is quite hard to know exactly who the list of actors will be. But I think the most important thing is just giving a space for those conversations to happen at the moment at a local level that this can't really be controlled from the middle. So I'm not really sure that central government should be in the driving seat. If anything, they should be trying to facilitate conversations that other people are leading rather than trying to drive them themselves. But that would be a culture shift that's required, I suspect. So in answer to your question, everyone should be involved. Kevin, there you go. There's a simple answer for you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
No problem.
Lorna, can I come to you with the same kind of question? Who's in the partnership?
Who's in the partnership? Well, I think we know who should be in the partnership. The players, all the players should be in the partnership. I think that what would be helpful, because I think when Tom was saying about difficulty trying to engage with employers and so on, and obviously all the points Prue's made. But actually, and I think Prue alluded to what's happening at the college where she's a governor about some excellent sectoral boards that have been set up to start those conversations. And that kind of initiative is happening in colleges around the country. Sometimes they're very specific because some colleges are very, very good at offering courses for particular sectors or types of industry. In others, you might get a broader range. But in other words, there's lots of very good practice around. So, there's lots of professionals out there who've been doing this for a long time and know what to do. And Paula in our breakout group made a very good point, I thought. She said, how do you make space to be creative amongst all the policy churn? And I think that's what the professionals out there are doing. They're finding those spaces to actually get on and make things work. So I think what central government and its agencies, because we're talking about a range of agencies here, Ofsted, IFATE, etc. There's a range of agencies who I think do need to start learning and getting in conversation with the people who are out there doing it. And I know it's difficult to talk about money, but resource it properly, because it's often done on the cheap.
Yes, absolutely. And look, I know I said I was going to come to all the panel, but actually I think that's a rather nice place to draw things to a close, if that's all right. I find this completely fascinating. I noted before, I think it was Lorna, you said that we are as a system good at doing good things in pockets. I think more discussion like this might increase the size of those pockets so that we can properly learn what we do well and what we haven't done well. And I do think it's incumbent upon all of us not just to learn our history, but to learn from our history, and we have started that today. With many thanks to Edge for bringing us together. And with that, Ollie, I'll hand over to you to close things up.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say a huge thanks to Kevin and to Chris and to all the panelists for their brilliant input. We have been recording this. We'll just edit it down and we'll send this out with the materials in the next few days. So do feel free to watch again and share with others who might not have been able to be here. So with that, just a huge thanks and have a lovely rest of your day.